Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Austin Talley, and I am your social capital moderator for today's presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. Throughout our presentation today, we invite you to engage with us. If you have any questions you'd like to ask of our presenters, please submit them into the Q&A box or the chat at any time, and we'll submit those to our panelists for answers. Additionally, we'll be sharing all of the content you see today with all of you in an email following our presentation today. If you have any issues with your technology, you can't see, you can't hear, please feel free, shoot me a message in the chat and I'll do my best to get you back online. Thank you again so much for joining us, everyone. And now I'd like to hand it over to our Social Capital CEO, Paula Berezin. Paula?
Thank you, Austin. First of all, we're so thrilled with the response and so many friends from Social Capital and new friends that have joined us. And I just wanted to share as we open this, that this webinar is a continuation from Social Capital 2020. And it's hard to believe that our last conference was probably the last conference that happened since everything that's gone down. And many of you may remember Wes Moore, who was our keynote. He gave a challenge to all of us when it comes to racial, social, economic disparities that we need to do more together. And I know for many of you that were there, it was very, very moving. And the next day in our town hall, Nancy Kirby from Feeding America stood up and said, the one thing that we can do together now is get out the vote. And we left the conference making a commitment together to do more. And as we are looking at the topics that we're going to cover, and I'll share more with you about that later, I'm very grateful to reintroduce to you three thought leaders that are in the space that all talked about getting out the vote. And they are Danielle Silber from ACLU, Alma Couverthie from League of Women Voters, and Huggins from Patagonia. Before we open with Danielle, many of you may have seen the quote from John Lewis that was published in today's New York Times, and I just thought it would be appropriate to open up with that quote. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful, nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. So thank you for all being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Danielle. Danielle, thanks for leading us off.
Hi, everyone. First, I want to thank Paula and the Social Capital team, as well as my amazing colleagues, Alma and JJ from League of Women Voters and Patagonia. It feels like we're, I don't know, trying to be the Justice League of sorts. It feels like the challenges that our country is facing at sometimes are overwhelming. And yet it's moments like these where we all come together and look at how we can increase civic education, civic literacy, civic engagement, where we really start to have more ownership and feel at least a little bit more control over ensuring that our democratic infrastructure can stay strong. So a little bit of background just to position why Paula invited me and the ACLU to share today. The ACLU turned 100 this year, and for the past 100 years, we've been fighting for all of the civil liberties entrusted by the Constitution to make sure that everyone living in the United States has those rights and civil liberties. And a huge piece that undergirds all of our work, as you can imagine, is voting rights. And voting rights, what that means for the ACLU encompasses all civic engagement rights. So that also encompasses work around the census. So we were fortunate to have won our litigation with the Supreme Court last year. However, that's now being challenged by the Trump administration. But all suffice to say, this country has ongoing experiences with increasing barriers to voting. And so some of what we want to discuss with you all today is helping to relook at a lot of the rhetoric that we're hearing about low voter turnout in this country, and then look at it in the context of COVID. So especially after the 2016 election, there was a lot of discussion about why was voter turnout so much lower than it was in 2008. And certainly there is voter depression. There are people who feel disaffected by our election system and by our candidates. However, there's a much broader, longer, deeper history around voter suppression and barriers to voting that I want to walk through today, so that all of us feel equipped going into this, to the ongoing primaries and to the upcoming November election, with a better understanding of the importance of what we can all do to help remove barriers to voting and improve access to the polls. So starting with a critical history around our country and voter access, especially knowing that so many companies and so many organizations across the country have been taking a greater stance around racial justice, I think it's important for us to take a hard look at what access to the polls has looked like throughout our history. So one strong example is coming out of Reconstruction after the end of the Civil War. For example, in the state of Louisiana, there was a brief period where, as many people may recall, there was incredible voter registration and civic participation by Black people, formerly enslaved people, across the South and including Louisiana. And just a few years later, because of the growth of the KKK and because the federal troops left the South, we saw a plummet in the number of registered voters in Louisiana and frankly across the American South. And so it's important to think about just this one data point to then extrapolate when we see a downturn in voter turnout to really question, is it just voter depression? Is it just disaffectation, or are there other barriers, other policies, other things in play in our country that is suppressing people's access to the polls? So coming out of all of these problems that we saw in terms of voter suppression across the Jim Crow South, we were lucky to have I shouldn't say we were lucky. Speaking of John Lewis, there were incredible movements across the United States to push for different civil rights policy, including the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a key aspect of which was essentially that if any state that previously had experienced voter suppression tried to change policies in their election, that it had to go through the federal justice department in order to be reviewed to make sure that there wasn't racial bias or other bias that was in play. And this has been a bipartisan piece of legislation that has been revered and reinstituted year over year. So in 1965, it was signed in by President Johnson. In 1982, it was re-signed by Reagan for 25 more years. In 2006, George W. Bush reauthorized it. And then in 2013, jumping ahead a little bit, the Supreme Court reviewed the question of whether there continued to need to be scrutiny, especially with the states that previously we'd seen a lot of voter suppression against Black voters. And the Supreme Court ruled that we were to some degree in a post-racial society, and that there was no longer a problem of barring people from the polls and barring people from the polls based on racial discrimination. And Justice Ginsburg famously said that throwing out this preclearance in the Voting Rights Act was essentially like going out into a rainstorm with an umbrella and saying, because I'm not wet, that there's no longer a problem. And so meanwhile, it's important to note that in 2008, we saw higher voter turnout than perhaps this country has ever seen, especially amongst younger voters, Black voters, urban voters, people with disabilities, you name it. It was really, I would say, a shining moment in this country's history in terms of civic engagement and participation. However, immediately after the 2008 election, in response to this huge upsurge in turnout, we saw a huge sweep of states start to pass voter barrier laws. And so what are some of those voter barrier laws, just so that we can be concrete about what we're talking about? So that includes voter ID laws. So we'll do a deeper dive there, signature matching requirements, which essentially is that when you sign your ballot, it has to match up with the signature on a state authorized ID. So many ballots were thrown out in the 2016 and 2018 elections, for example, because the signatures weren't a perfect match. Limiting early voting and poll hours, so especially for working folks. And I know JJ will talk about time to vote and the importance of making sure that working folks have time to be able to vote, but limiting early voting and limiting poll hours can really decrease working people's ability to access the polls. Poll closures. So for example, many of you may recall in Georgia and in Kansas, in Georgia, there were as a movement to close 6 polling locations in predominantly Black communities. And in Kansas, they closed a polling location and moved it to over a mile away from public transportation in a predominantly Latinx community. Voter roll purges. So we saw this in Ohio and other states where if people didn't vote in the latest election, the state decided that they could purge people from the rolls, but didn't communicate with constituents. So people didn't necessarily realize when they went to the polls on election day that they were no longer registered to vote. Excuse required for absentee voting. So we've seen changes in this in the midst of COVID, but it still continues to be a problem in the sense that as opposed to anyone, including here where I'm situated in the state of New York, previously to the past year, if I didn't have a specific excuse to not go to the polls, then I couldn't mail in my ballot or even request an absentee ballot. So as you can imagine, these are just some of the tactics that make it much harder for people to get to the polls or to access the ballot. And so some of the greatest work from the ACLU is trying to limit all of these different barriers so that we can see higher voter turnout. So just to do a quick deeper dive to be explicit about why some of these tactics end up prohibiting certain segments of the population from being able to vote. Wisconsin is a great example, and many of us saw in the news how the Wisconsin primary was a bit of a fiasco in terms of there being incredibly long lines, many people not being able to end up casting their ballot. And so in the case of Wisconsin, there's a real economic injustice piece to the voter ID laws. So the state of Wisconsin has literally looked at who has certain forms of identification and who doesn't have certain forms of voter identification, and then who cannot vote based on that. So for example, a Go Pass, which is a government issued transportation pass with a photo ID on it, is not a recognized form of identification that allows you to vote. Similarly, a University of Wisconsin's issued voter ID card, student ID card is not eligible. So we see in Wisconsin in particular that this disproportionately impacts students and young people as well as Black voters. Another example is just looking at the sweeping impact of voter ID laws on the younger generation, on Gen Z in particular. So another example similar to Wisconsin is in Texas. A concealed handgun license is a valid voter ID, but a University of Texas ID is not. Similarly in New Hampshire, that if you have a driver's license from another state and you're a student, you actually can't vote. You have to apply for a New Hampshire state license in order to vote in the state of New Hampshire. So all of these laws, as you can imagine, just make it all the more harder for certain segments of our population to vote. The final example that I'll point to help undergird why voter ID laws are barriers to voting that are discriminatory to begin with, let alone in the midst of COVID, is this was a lawsuit that the ACLU filed in North Carolina, whereby the state representatives literally went to the North Carolina University to find out if they didn't include student IDs as a recognizable or as a form of identification to allow voting, how that would impact the Black voters. And so we actually caught this red herring email, but it proves that the state representatives were trying to figure out which photo IDs would be would help to suppress certain demographics from being able to vote. So thinking about all of those different voter barriers that I listed and the impact that that's had in terms of suppressing the vote, especially in key states across the country, now imagine how those voter barriers are compounded by the COVID crisis. So just to go over a few, there are still many states across the country that don't allow folks to vote without a specific excuse. Which in the midst of COVID can be incredibly dangerous and scary, right? People should not have to choose between their safety and being able to exercise their right to vote. Similarly, from an economic justice standpoint and an access standpoint, for states that require a photo ID for voting, you may be able to vote absentee, but then you have to supply a copy of your photo ID. And I don't know about you all, but I don't have a printer at home. Many people don't have copiers at home. And so this can be a prohibitive step for many people across the country. Similarly, from an economic justice standpoint, not everyone has postage or envelopes readily on hand in order to avail themselves of voting. Also, similarly, a challenge in terms of voting in the midst of COVID, that many states still require a witness signature. So if you request an absentee ballot, you need to have a witness sign it alongside you. For people who are living alone, for elderly folks, for people with pre-existing conditions, it's not tenable or easy for them to necessarily have a witness signature, or in some states, there's even a requirement for a notary to sign your absentee ballot. So you can see how the barriers just keep mounting in some of these states, and in some states, these different barriers compound one another. So I'm happy to go into more detail about each of these different barriers if it's helpful, but I don't want to dive in too much here. The point that's important to relay is just that there are ongoing barriers to the polls, and we need as much of civil society and the business community to help play a role in removing these barriers outright and or providing solutions to help make it easier for people to cast their ballot. So not wanting to be a Danielle downer, as I say to my stepdaughter, I will dive into some solutions. First up, there is a lot of advocacy happening at both the federal and state levels to push for improved access to the polls. So on the federal side, there's actually an initiative from Business for America, which over 200 companies have now signed on to, which pushes the federal government to pass the Vote Safe Act, which would allow for no excuse absentee ballot casting nationwide. It would implement early voting in states across the country. So there are still many states that don't have early voting. And it would create an appropriations package so that all the states that are currently struggling with having enough money to actually create viable infrastructure around mail-in ballots would have enough money to have those processes go smoothly. Similarly, at the state level, there's advocacy and in the ACLU's case, litigation happening to push the leaders in these states to remove barriers to the polls. Second solution that's really important, especially for everyone on this call, is to think about what more robust messaging and voter education looks like and how to start that messaging earlier than we have in previous elections. So I'm just listing two valuable resources, the ACLU, because we're on the front lines of litigation and advocacy efforts to remove barriers to voting in states across the country. We created this tool with up-to-date, by the minute even information. Sometimes our information is more up-to-date than state websites with information about deadlines for requesting your absentee ballot, how to request your absentee ballot, information on how you can submit your absentee ballot and deadlines and know your rights information therein. And then I'll let Alma speak to the amazing resource that the League of Women Voters puts together, vote411.org. And then a few other flags is we need poll worker recruitment. So one of the other dangers is a dearth of poll workers at polling locations across the country, since we know that elderly Americans have really taken on a leadership role at many polling locations across the country, and they're also the most under threat when it comes to COVID. So we desperately need for more volunteers nationwide to staff these polling locations. And then election and voter protection support. So as we've seen in the primaries to date, there have been long lines at some polling locations. There's been a lot of confusion about voter ID or other barriers. And so it's critical that we equip every voter with information for how they can access support should they face a challenge when they're at the polls. And then knowing that there's some funny business happening in a bunch of states around voting and voter access, we also need volunteers to be monitoring election boards across the country so that we don't, like we saw in Georgia in 2018, see election boards suddenly deciding to close polling locations in certain communities. And then finally, and this is a little bit nerve-wracking, but knowing that we're going to see a higher number of mail-in ballots than ever before in this country, it's important for us to start messaging and changing expectations around when we might know the results of the election. Because we've already seen from tweets from our president, for example, that there's a lot of misinformation being shared and a lot of fear-mongering happening around trying to get the general public to not necessarily trust our election infrastructure. And so we need to, as opposed to fomenting fear, need to start messaging that it's normal and it might be natural for it to take longer for us to understand who have won elections. So with that, thank you so much for giving me this platform and welcoming me. And I would love to answer any questions that you all have.
Thank you so much, Danielle. I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to submit those into the chat. We'll send them over to Danielle and give Danielle a chance to answer those. We've got just a few minutes for those. So Danielle, I've sent you over some questions. And a reminder to everyone else, if you have any questions at all, please feel free, put them in the chat, and we'll get them over to Danielle for you.
So there's a great question about a Spanish voter guide. So I'm super proud and excited on behalf of the League of Women Voters that there is, but I'll let Alma speak more to that in the next section. And then there's a question from We at Community Health Charities. About the nature of whether sharing this type of employee engagement tools around voter engagement is partisan. I think one of the really important ways that businesses and organizations can play a critical role right now is making sure that we disassociate partisan from political. I think it's really important that we're political, especially in this moment where we're acknowledging that we have to grapple with the history and the legacy of racism in our country, when we're in a moment in our society where we have to grapple with the fact that our health systems are set up differently in every state, that it's important for us to be civically engaged. It's important for us to be political, and being political does not mean that we are being partisan. From my conversations with corporate leaders in particular, they've acknowledged that in the past, those two things have been conflated. I think the other talking point that I realize is a harder one, but the history of barriers to voting, sadly, has been pushed by both the Republican and the Democratic parties. So it's not a partisan issue to want to improve access to the polls and improve civic engagement. So I think it's really important that we identify as organizations what our values are, stick to those values, and transcend the dialogue that wanting people to be able to vote and wanting to have high voter turnout in this country might be a partisan issue.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And now I'm going to turn it over to you, Alma. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here in a moment to start this presentation. Thank you, everyone, for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Alma Couverthie. I'm the National Organizing Director for the League of Women Voters. And just like the ACLU, we also turned 100 this year on February 14. So it's been 100 years of empowering voters and defending democracy by doing a lot of education work, advocacy, litigation, and organizing. So we're gonna talk about how do we get out the vote, knowing that all that we know about why this election is so important to all of us and the challenges that we need to overcome, including COVID. How do we all become part of our active democracy and help turn out that vote? And that's what we're gonna be talking about now. Why is it that we are gonna be doing turn out the vote? Because it's proven that it works. When people receive a touch from someone real, I'm not talking about a bot or a text message from somebody that you don't know, those are effective, but not as much. But when family and friends reach out, when somebody from your community reach out, we can actually increase turnout by double digits. And on that note, we've learned that, for example, when someone real on the phone, even if you don't necessarily know that person, calls you to encourage you to turn out to vote, we can increase that percentage by 2 or 3 points. Local efforts can make big difference. And for all of us who are very connected to our communities, it is very important to know that all of those efforts matter because we are sometimes the trusted messengers. We are the ones that people are listening to for information. So the way that we show up and the way that we encourage others matters. We also use Vote for 1-1, and I'm gonna talk a little bit more about that, but this is the tool that we have created over the years. It is a comprehensive tool where all the information is up to date, even information provided by candidates themselves in their own voice, and now it is available also in Spanish. And it is an opportunity, if we're trying to develop our volunteer muscle, what a better opportunity this year to commit our volunteers to engage with turning out the vote. So these are some of the top strategies in light of COVID. Some of the traditional methods of turning out the vote have not happened. So we want to make sure that we tailor our strategies to the current moment. So we use, and hold on one second. I went really ahead here. This is where we are. Okay. So yes, there you go. These are the 3 most effective methods. Door knocking, nothing replaces that. And we are challenged because we can't do a lot of door knocking today. So that gets us to live phone calls, calling our friends and family, getting on a Zoom call, joining a local meeting, even the app next door, it's being used to turn out the vote. Get creative and use the tools that you have at hand. And of course, mailing postcards is still a good way to get voters engaged. All right, so now we're here. The way that we use it is we do these calls and we reach out to people and connect them to 4111. That is the place to get the trusted of-the-day information in English and Spanish. If you want to check your registration status, you can do it there. If you need to register, you can also do it there. Any changes, and believe me that there have been many changes coming up with COVID and poll closures or changing times and directions, all of those are reflected in Vote 411. We also direct outreach to actual individual voters. So it's not like hanging flyers, but we always recommend to reach to the people that you know, whether it is your church community or your school community, find ways to reach those that you have a natural connection with. And be strategic about it. Time your outreach just before key deadlines. If you know where your registration deadline is in your community, make sure that you're making a round of calls right before that. Or if you're gonna mail something, then make sure that you do it with plenty of time so it gets to the recipient by the time it's useful. And of course, time them around the election day and make sure that you are preparing for it. And another way that we can also create the most impact, and based on the presentation that Danielle made, is to target who are usually the most underrepresented and more vulnerable to voter suppression tactics. And those could be first-time and young voters, new citizens, lower income voters, and recent movers. So Top ways to reach out voters: phone calls and phone banking. You can use a voter list, or you can join your local league, which is going to be doing a lot of phone calls and phone banking, and we're always asking for volunteers. You can go to our website, lwb.org, and find your local league and find ways to volunteer. It's as simple as that. You can use regular mail if you like writing and postcards. That is always very effective. And you can also use emails and texting. However, texting to people that we know has shown to be very effective, typically less effective, but can be helpful. It is, if you use a relational organizing digital tool, it might help to warm up the contact. But cold texting has been shown not to be as effective, although it is quite popular. So now let's talk about Vote for 1-1, because there's a lot of effort that has been put on this tool to be the most effective as possible. In Vote for 1-1, you can find national candidate info, polling place locations, registration tools, whatever requirements for IDs or others, absentee ballot information and how to acquire them. If there are any ballot measures on your ballot, all the information about those ballot measures will be found there. Early voting options and election dates. And this is why we do this. We do this over the years, and it has been a trusted source of objective and nonpartisan election information. Since 2006, Vote for 1-1 has served over 10 million voters. We reach all 50 states, providing meticulously researched information from local, zip code level to state and federal level. It matters because election rules differ state by state, often changing year from year. And like we see this year, even within the year, even within the week, they continue to change. If you use Vote for 1-1, then you are sure that you are getting the most updated information with the requirements that change, or what do you need to do to get prepared to vote. Confirming this information before heading to the polls saves time, and it's less frustrating, and it helps for a smoother process. One way that organizations and companies can help promote Vote for 1-1 is with the addition of a white label. And there's many ways to customize this. Just some notes on that. The site was the winner of the 2020 Webby Award, and that was featured in the New York Times in June of this year. For November, we have a full down ballot candidate information for every single voter in America. Our goal is to serve 6 million voters, and we're already at 2 million, which is double of what we were last year at the same time. And 1 million of those just came in the last 6 weeks. It's 50 states bilingual content, so for those who were asking if we have information in Spanish, everything in Vote for 1-1 is available in Spanish. And we have daily updates related to COVID-related election changes. This is powered by our volunteers. We have 750 local league teams who are updating Vote for 1-1 constantly. So in order to access the white label, I can put you in touch with Maggie Bush, who works with our partnerships. But you can, we can customize it in any way that you want, using your company logo, branding colors, messaging, and other things. So how do you take action? One thing that is very important to know is that in order to get involved, you don't need to wait till November. You don't need to wait till October. You can start right now. Remember that this election is gonna be like no other, and we need to support election officials so that every vote gets counted in a safe way. With the increase that we expect in absentee ballots, tallying votes will take more time. And it is highly likely that ballots will be counted late into the night all over the country. So for those of us who love instant gratification on election night, take a dose of patience, because the election results are gonna be rolling in days after. And you know what? That is perfectly okay. That means that the system is working and that every vote is getting counted. A delayed result with an increased number of mail ballots means that the system is working as it should to ensure the integrity of our election process. A surge in mail ballots requires our election officials to adapt their ballot counting practices, and it is important for voters to be patient. complete and accurate ballot count is more important than a fast ballot count. And with the increase of voting in 2020 and absentee voting, it is essential that every vote is counted and every voter's voice is heard. We should all prepare for many election results to be announced after the day. How can you support right now? You can sign up as an organizational or individual partner for National Voter Registration Day. You can follow the link. You can register as a poll worker. For more information on that, you can look at workerelections.com or Power the Polls. And for volunteer for election protection, you can look at 866 Our Vote for election protection volunteer work. Another thing that you can do is advocate. Voters should not have to choose between their health and their vote. I urge you to contact your senator today and ask them to include the $4 billion in funding to secure our elections in the next stimulus package. You can visit our website at lwb.org and join our action alert. And thank you very much, and I will stay for all your questions. As a matter of fact, one last thing. If you still need more inspiration of what to do, we have a blog. It's 100 days and 100 ways to get ready for election day. Look at this, for the Catholics like me, as an advent calendar of a thing that you can do to make sure that you're ready for election day. We are at day 96, and I challenge all of you to see how many of these you will do. Thank you very much, and I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Alma. That was excellent. Really appreciate that. Folks, again, I just want to remind everyone, we are taking questions. So if you have any questions at all, please feel free, shoot them over in the chat, put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get them over to our presenters. Alma, I've sent a question over to you, and I think maybe Danielle might also like to help out with this question as well. I'll let you read it aloud, and then we'll answer those questions for you.
Is that the one from Beverly?
Yes.
Okay. There are many organizations working to increase voter participation this year. Is there an organized effort to encourage all of those organizations to work together this year without the typical competition? Very interesting question. My answer to that would be that there is enough work for everyone. This should not be a competition. We should be really working with our communities. We should be working with the relationships that we have on the ground and collaborate. The League collaborates with the ACLU and with many partners on the ground. So what I would say is, look for the organization that is closest and more convenient to you and join. The important thing is that you are active. Whatever organization you choose, that's great that there is choice. Make sure that you choose the one that works for you.
Excellent, thank you. I think I wanted to see if Danielle wanted to sort of add a little bit to that. Danielle?
Sure. I'm not sure if you can turn my video on, but either way, here we go. Thanks. So echoing what Alma said, I think it's really a testament to the times, but also a testament to the new leadership across organizations and across companies that I've actually seen unprecedented collaboration. So for example, I work closely with Alma's colleague Maggie that she mentioned, whereby the ACLU is really forthright in that we can fill a sliver of the need, but that there are other organizations like the League of Women Voters who have the core competency of making sure that there's up-to-date information about where your polling location is, what's going to be on your ballot. So we need to have a coalition effort. I think we're also seeing a coalition of private sector and public sector entities. So like Vote Early Day, which is on October 24th, is a huge, group of nonprofits and of companies that are all pushing to make sure that we're celebrating opportunities for people to vote and really amplifying all of these different civic engagement opportunities through all of our platforms in sync with one another. The last example that I'll share, because I know JJ will go into some examples on the private sector side, but there's the Civic Alliance is another group that's emerged that is really pulling. They were working on the census and now they're working on voter engagement. And so they, as an entity, have actually been pulling in resources from different organizations and different companies. So I agree with you. There's been weird, competition, if you will, amongst sister organizations in the past, but I think the moment calls for more collaboration, and the end goal, to Alma's point, is that we all need to plug in where we can, and there's sadly plenty of work for all of us to take on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Alma, especially. We love your community organizing persona. And now I'm going to turn it over to JJ.
Thank you, Paula, so much. And thank you, Austin, and everyone at Social Capital for welcoming Patagonia into this space. Also, thank you to the Democracy All-Stars, Danielle and Alma. It is amazing to be able to get to be on a panel with you two and just be able to speak with everyone on this webinar. I never imagined being referred to as a thought leader, like I was referred to along with Danielle and Alma. I work for Patagonia, and I started out as a seasonal sales associate, where way back when I was selling shirts and jackets to our customers. But like Paula said in the beginning of this, when she quoted John Lewis, this is all about ordinary people with extraordinary vision. And the vote is the most powerful tool we all have. I'm here to represent Patagonia as a member of the business community and talk about a simple first step that companies can take to support our country. And I know I've been looking at the attendee list, and I know some of you work for companies, some of you work for nonprofits. And I'm going to talk about a program called Time to Vote, which Patagonia helped to co-found back in 2018. And Time to Vote is specifically for the for-profit sector. It's for businesses. It's a business-to-business initiative. But any organization, if you employ people, you can adopt the ethos of Time to Vote. And what Time to Vote does is companies sign up and they pledge to literally give their employees time to vote in the election. And this year, as we all know, that time is maybe or maybe not such an issue. This time around, we're looking into voting by mail and voting early, or voting on election day as probably a last resort for people. But what Time to Vote does is the companies who join Time to Vote, they pledge to give the time to their employees to either vote on election day, and most companies give between 2 and 4 hours of paid time off. However, we've seen about half a dozen companies this year decide to turn election day into a paid day off. But there's also some things we need to do beyond that in light of COVID-19, and that involves giving our employees information, education, like what you just saw from Danielle and Alma about voting by mail, voting early, and helping our folks, depending on what state they live in, overcome all the obstacles that are going to be in front of us this year because of COVID-19. And so that's going to require a lot of education from our company leaders. We have 585 businesses so far enrolled in Time to Vote. I spoke with many of you at the Social Capital conference back in February, which feels like that was 2 years ago. And at that point, I think we had around 400 or so companies in Time to Vote. We're trying to get up to 1,000 by election day. But since I spoke with you all, Time to Vote has recruited Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Twitter, JP Morgan Chase, Uber. We also have companies like PVH, New Balance, Lyft, Walmart, Target, Ben & Jerry's, Levi's, PayPal. These companies represent a swath of American voters, of American employees. This represents every state in the country. Workers from blue collar, factory floor, retail workers, cab drivers, all the way on up to white collar executives. Time to Vote is truly nonpartisan. You think of the array of employees who work for Time to Vote companies, and you can just imagine the variance in political ideology, in race, sexual orientation, everything. These are all types of people. This is as American as you can get. If you're not a member of a business, please think about your organization, how you can support your employees by literally giving them time off to either vote on election day or vote early, or help them figure out how to get their absentee ballot and vote by mail. It is so much easier for people, for working people, if their boss helps them with this by giving them maybe just a couple hours, maybe a half day of paid time off to tackle this issue. It is not expensive for us to do, but it is so impactful. We have seen that when employees hear from their leadership, from the leaders in their organization, that voting is important to the company, that the company or the nonprofit feels that it's important that every person who is involved there has the opportunity to exercise their right to vote. That works wonders for employee morale. It makes people just feel like their boss really cares about them, not just as someone who contributes to the organization, but someone who contributes to society. This year, and if you work at a company and you're not already in Time to Vote, please check out maketimetovote.org. I'll drop that URL in the chat momentarily. This year, Danielle already mentioned this, but this year, voting by mail is going to be more important than ever. And also, for those who can't vote by mail and need to go to the polling precincts, there's going to be a dire shortage of poll workers. And Danielle mentioned Power the Polls, and I'm going to mention that again, and I'll drop the URL in the chat afterward. You can go to powerthepolls.org, and there you can sign up to be a poll worker. What that website does is you type in your zip code, and it directs you to your local elections office, and it's fairly seamless to sign up there to become a poll worker. And then Power the Polls will follow up with you in the weeks afterward to make sure you've actually gone ahead and signed up to be a poll worker and gone through with your training. I've been talking to elections officials around the country, and the one thing they are all saying is that they need poll workers this year, desperately. Most poll workers are over the age of 60, and therefore they're going to be more at risk. If they put themselves out in public on election day, they're more at risk to the effects of COVID-19 than people who are under the age of 60. And therefore, they're not going to do it this year. And we need to supplement those poll workers with a group of young, healthy people who can fill in, who are up to the task. So if you have employees who are under the age of 60 and do not have underlying health conditions, do not live with someone with underlying health conditions, or take care of someone with underlying health conditions, please tell those people to check out powerthepolls.org. If your employees are comfortable, they can sign up there. And if they're willing to follow the proper safety protocols, they can go through the training and they can become poll workers, because our country desperately needs that this year. The election will happen on November 3rd. And we as employers need to do everything we can to make sure it goes as smoothly as possible. Just looking over my notes to see if I missed anything else. That is everything I have. I'll drop those URLs into the chat, and I'm happy to entertain any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, JJ. That was an excellent presentation. I just want to remind everyone, drop any questions in the chat that you might have. JJ, do you have any final thoughts or insights or advice that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think what we've seen at Patagonia and what we hear from the other companies we work with on Time to Vote is, for one thing, the business leaders are held up to such a higher standard than they were even a couple years ago. And we've seen really in the last couple months with all the calls for racial justice around the country, where Patagonia in particular and other companies are getting questions from our customers saying, what are you doing on this? What are you doing to advance racial justice in your organization and in the country as a whole? And you, as business people, we can't hide anymore. We can't say, well, this is our lane. You know, we only focus on environmentalism. We only focus on this or that. we try not to spread ourselves too thin and weigh in on every issue because that would dilute us. But there are some areas where we have to expand, and people are really looking for our leadership in ways that we weren't used to being looked at in the last, just as recently as a couple years ago. And one thing you can do as a business leader or a nonprofit leader or anyone who leads other people is give them that time and those resources to vote. And when you're the employee receiving that communication from your boss, we find that people, they listen to their boss, they hopefully like their boss, and are more likely to follow through when they get that communication from their leadership, because they hold those leaders in high regard. And then what that does is that creates a culture where voting and, more importantly, civic engagement is valued within that organization. And the long game for time to vote, and I think for all the work that we're all embarking on here, is to increase voter turnout in this country. That's the overall vision for what we're all doing.
Thank you so much, JJ. And I will say thank you to everybody. And JJ, you're very humble. I will say from our community, you were very popular along with Alma and Danielle at Social Capital. So I just wanted to first say thank you to our Democracy All-Stars. And before I turn it back over to Austin, I just wanted to share a couple of closing remarks. And also we are opening it up to a lounge that's a little bit more casual to have more conversation with the speakers. But before we officially close, I wanted to share with you all that we, you know, based on everything that's been going on, we really want this community to know that at Social Capital, we are looking for ways to do more on our part. And one of the things that we are doing is this webinar is the first in a series of free webinars to the community called Social Capital Community Insights, where we're going to be hosting conversations on issues that are impacting our sector. And specifically, the three issues that are to the forefront right now for us are: one, social justice and anti-racism; two, cross-sector collaboration; and three, what we've covered today, civic engagement. We want you to know that we recognize that we need a more inclusive and welcoming sector. To that end, we'd like each of you to let us know who else from your organization, other strategic partners in the space or groups, particularly in equity, diversity, and inclusion, that you follow and admire, that we can include in these conversations going forward. And please feel free to put the recommendations in the chat or just contact us post-webinar, and just stay close with us as we will with you. And so now, as we officially close, I wanted to thank all of you for being part of our Social Capital community. And over to you, Austin. And thank you, Austin, for saving us with technology. So to our moderator, Austin.
Thank you so much, Paula. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. We really, really appreciate you guys being here. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break, and then we're going to invite you to come back into the room and join us for a lounge discussion. All right, so we're going to open it up to you guys to be able to ask questions of our speakers live and engage in the discussions that keep our democracy moving forward. All right, thank you so much again for joining us, and we'll see you back here in about 5 minutes.